Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And from the valid differences are the differences between conditions or shurut of a contract and conditions made in a contract. So there's a difference between conditions of a contract and conditions in a contract. So as for conditions of a contract, then we say that these are the conditions without which the contract would be invalid. And as for conditions in a contract, then this is something which one of the two parties would stipulate for their benefit, and that the contract could still be valid without these conditions in place. So these conditions are only in place for the benefit of one of the two parties. So what we say is that the conditions of a contract are conditions stipulated by the Shari' or the lawgiver, who is Allah Jalla wa Ala. As for conditions in a contract, they are stipulated by one of the two parties. And what results from this is that the conditions of a contract will always be correct as they are stipulated by Allah. As for conditions in a contract, they could be correct or they could be invalid and not approved by the Sharia. And also we say that the conditions in a contract are not necessary for the contract, whereas conditions of a contract are necessary for the contract, meaning to say for its validity. At best, the conditions in a contract means that the contract will be kept going or kept in effect, such that if one of the two parties, after having agreed to the condition made by the other party, does not fulfill the condition, then the other party can cancel this contract. So the contract itself is correct, however, the other party has the choice to cancel the contract. So for example, if the seller sells a house to the buyer, but he makes a condition in this trade that he, meaning the seller, will be allowed to live in this house for 1 month. Now this is not a condition to make the contract valid. The contract can be valid even without this condition. However, this condition will allow the contract to keep going, such that if the seller disagrees, the buyer can simply annul the contract. Let us suppose now the seller does not want to stay in the house for a month anymore. The trade will still go ahead, and the contract is valid, even though this condition was not realized. However, contrast that with this. One of the conditions of the trade is that the price must be known. Now imagine this seller sells a house to the buyer for an unknown price. Here we say even if both parties are happy, this trade is invalid because the condition of the trade has not been met. So when it comes to the condition of a trade or a contract, then the contentment of both parties does not matter. The only thing which matters is whether the condition has been met or not. But when it comes to conditions in a trade, which is stipulated by one of the two parties, then the contentment of the two parties does matter. So that if they both agree that they will not go ahead with this condition anymore, the trade still goes ahead because they're both happy, and that's all that matters. So as for conditions in a trade, we can divide them up into 3 categories. Number 1, which is sahih or valid. Number 2, which is fasid or corrupt, which is not to be respected, but the trade can still go ahead. And number 3, it is the condition which is fasid and also it corrupts the whole contract, so that even the whole contract is not allowed to go ahead. An example of the first is what we have given in our house example. An example of the second would be in the hadith of Barira, who asked Aisha for help in paying off for her freedom, but the owners of Barira said that the wala of Barira would belong to her, so they made this stipulation. So the Prophet allowed the trade to go ahead, but he simply nullified this batil condition. He said any condition which is not in the book of Allah, meaning to say that it opposes the Sharia, then this is batil even if there were 100 conditions made. An example of the third would be the mut'ah marriage. So this is a contract, but in the contract you have the stipulation that the marriage will last for, let us say, 2 months, and afterwards they would separate. This is the mut'ah marriage, which the Shia are famous for, and such a condition would render the whole contract invalid. Whereas in the second example, it's just the condition which is invalid and not to be respected, but the contract is still valid. And from the weak differences is that some ulama make a difference between the debt of the salam transaction and the debt from any other transaction. Well, first of all, what is the salam or the salaf trade? You've heard of the buy now and pay later schemes. Well, the salam is the complete opposite. It is pay now and take your goods later. So the buyer is going to pay the money up front right now, and he will agree with the seller that the seller is going to bring the goods in, let us say, 1 year, whatever the agreed date is, and the amount of goods and the nature of the goods are well known. And this used to be done quite a bit during the time of the Prophet. So let us suppose the buyer gives his money for some wheat, let us say 100 sa of wheat, to be given in 1 year's time. So he pays the money up front and he's expecting his wheat in 1 year's time. So the date to collect his wheat comes, but the seller says, I do not have any wheat. However, I do have barley. Why don't I give you the barley instead of the wheat, which we agreed to 1 year ago? Now the madhab of the Hanabila says this is impermissible. And also, if let us say you give the seller 100 riyal for him to give you the 100 sa of wheat in 1 year's time, but you tell the seller, look, I don't fully trust you, give me a rahan or a pledge, such that if you do not bring me the wheat, I'm able to sell this rahan or this pledge and take back my money. So this is some sort of guarantee for me. The madhab of the Hanabila says this is also impermissible. And for both of these rulings of impermissibility, they give their reason and their evidence that in so doing, so if he gives you barley instead, or if he is unable to give you the wheat and you sell off the rahan and take your price back that way, what you're actually doing is that you're changing the debt of this salam trade, the debt being of course the wheat. You are changing this to something other than wheat. So you're changing this either to barley or to money. And in the hadith of Abu Dawud's Sunan, Man aslama fi shay'in fala yasrifhu ila ghayrih. Whoever gives money in advance for something, then he should not change this for other than what he gave the money for. And we see in both of our previous two examples, you are changing the wheat for something else. However, we say that the hadith is weak. Many of the muhaddithin have graded it to be weak, so we do not act in accordance with it. And even if it was authentic, we can interpret it like this. It means do not change this salam, or the price which you have given in advance, do not change this price for something other than the price you have given. It does not mean don't change that which you were to receive for something other than what you are due to receive. So the wheat in this case. So to illustrate this with an example, a man who is the buyer gives 100 riyal to the seller, that the seller is going to give him 100 sa of wheat after 1 year. The 1 year elapses and the seller does not have the 100 sa of the wheat. So the buyer says, okay, what we'll do is that we'll make another salam contract. Only this time, I am not going to give you any money. You see this 100 dirahim which you have in your hands, O seller, we'll make this into the price, which is to be given to you up front. And instead of giving 100 sa after 1 year, you would have to give 110 sa. So a case like this would not be allowed. Why? Because this is simply charging somebody more in exchange for more time which you give him to pay back the debt. This is just conventional usury. You cannot pay back your debt. The bank tells you, okay, we will allow you more of a respite. However, because of this, you will have to pay us back more. This is the exact riba which Allah Jalla wa Ala speaks about in the Quran, that do not eat up the riba multiplied. And so what he's done here is that he has changed the price which he has paid up front to another price. And he has profited from this. We're talking about the buyer here. The buyer has profited from this. So in this way then, the hadith, if it was to be authentic, can be understood. Otherwise, we know the hadith to be inauthentic. And so therefore what is correct here is that in both of our previous two examples which we have mentioned, the one about changing the wheat to the barley and the other one about taking the rahan, both of these scenarios are permissible because you are allowed to change the merchandise to a different merchandise in the bay' salam. However, we must make an essential note here that if you are going to change the debt of the salam to another one, so from wheat to barley in our example, then we need to make sure that we are not taking back more than what we ought to be taking. So in our example, 100 sa of wheat were due to the buyer. Now if he changes this for barley, then this must be done at the proper exchange rate. So if we say 1 sa of wheat is worth 2 sa of barley, and this is the current exchange rate, then we would say that the buyer receives 200 sa of barley. As for if the buyer demands 201 sa of barley, then this is impermissible, because what you have done is that you have profited from something which has not come under your guarantee. The 100 sa of wheat which were owed to you have not come under your possession, but yet you have profited from it by taking 201 sa of barley. As for if you only took 200 sa of barley, which is the proper exchange rate, then you have not profited from something which has not come under your possession, or for which you are not responsible for. And the Prophet forbade that anyone should profit from that which is not in his possession. Okay, so that was that. So continuing on from the valid differences in the contracts and from the examples is what we mentioned in Qaida number 53, which said that if it becomes known to us that the contract is batil, then anything which resulted from that is also batil. But if it was annulled through the choice of one of the two parties, then anything which resulted from that contract is not batil. So we gave the example, if a man sells a house to the buyer, and then the buyer puts up this house for rent, and obviously he earns the money from the rent. Then after that, it becomes known to us that this contract was invalid. Then what we say is that this renting contract which resulted from the initial trade is also invalid, and hence the money is not allowed to go to the buyer, and that the renting contract must also be annulled, and that the renting money goes to the seller of the house in the initial trade. However, on the other hand, if they both annul the trade contract, then we said the scholars have differed. When you annul a contract, is this annulment of the contract from the very root and beginning of the contract, or does it begin from the time you annulled the contract? Because if we say it is from the very root and essence of the contract, then in our example it would mean that the ijara or the renting contract would also have to be annulled, and so the money from the rent contract would not belong to the buyer. It would belong to the seller of the house in the initial contract. But if we say that the annulment is from the time at which it is annulled, then it simply means that the money from the time of the initial trade to the annulment of this trade of the house, this money from the rent contract belongs to the buyer, and then after the annulment, any money from the rent contract will go to the seller of the house. Because remember, the possession of the house has now returned back to the initial seller. So that is the difference amongst the scholars there. As for if it turns out that the contract in the beginning was batil, and so its presence is like its absence, then the ijara contract must also be batil, and it has to be annulled. Whereas, on the other hand, if one of the two parties annulled the trade contract, the initial trade contract of the house, then the ijara contract can still go ahead and continue. If we say that the fasq or the annulment is from the time it takes place, and that it is not an annulment of the original contract from its very beginning, because if that was the case, then the ijara contract must also be annulled. So to give an example with numbers, Zayd sells a house to Amr for £100,000. Amr now puts up this house for rent to Khalid, who will pay him £100 for every month, and the contract is for 1 year. So at the end of the year, the ijara is going to be worth £1,200. Now, if after 2 months it becomes known to us that this initial sale between Amr and Zayd was batil, then the ijara contract must become batil as well, and for the 2 months in which Khalid paid £100 each, so £200, this £200 goes to the owner of the house, who is not Amr, because the house does not belong to him anymore, it is Zayd, or whoever the owner of the house is, and the ijara contract has to be cancelled, because the initial trade is cancelled, because it is batil. On the other hand, if after 2 months Amr and Zayd agree that they're going to cancel this contract, so the contract itself is sahih from the Sharia perspective, however, they both agree that they would want to cancel the contract. Okay, that's fine. Now the difference is, if we go with the opinion that the cancellation happens from the time it happens, then we say the £200 belongs to Amr, and for the rest of the 10 months, worth £1,000, this money will go to Zayd, who was the original owner of the house, but the ijara contract is intact. If we say that this cancellation is the cancellation from the asl, or from the root of the original trade, then what this means is that the ijara contract must also be cancelled. And so this would take the same ruling as our first scenario, where the contract itself was batil. And so what would happen there is that the ijara would be cancelled. As for the £200, then this will go not to Amr but to Zayd, who was the original owner and seller of the house. And on top of that, the ijara contract has to be cancelled, just like the other example. So you can see the great difference depending on the different opinions. And from the examples of the weak differences, in the case of testimony, is that some scholars say that there is a difference when a person gives a testimony. If he does not use the word of shahada, then it is not counted as a testimony. So he has to say ashhadu or shahidtu, I witness or I witnessed. So if he uses the word of shahada, then it is a shahada. If he does not use the word of shahada, it is not a shahada or a testimony. But what is correct here is that it does not matter what words are used, as long as the news information which is given is something which is positive and he is sure about, so there is the jazm or surety, then it counts as a shahada. And we don't need to look at the wording used. So if the witness says that Zayd took Amr's money, then in this sentence he has not said that I witnessed Zayd taking Amr's money. So would we now say that this does not count as a testimony? The answer is no, according to the correct opinion. Rather, this counts as a testimony because it is giving a news information item with a surety. And to this effect, we can narrate a little episode. It was said to Al-Imam Ahmad that a person is saying that I say that the 10 will be in Jannah, but I do not witness this. Meaning, I do not say that I witness this. He's of course talking about the Al-Asharatul Mubashara, the 10 companions who in one hadith were given glad tidings of Jannah. So this man is saying, yes, they will be in Jannah, but I do not say that I witness they will be in Jannah, or that I give shahada that they will be in Jannah. And Al-Imam Ahmad replied, إِذَا قَالَ فَقَدَ شَهِدْ. If he said this, then he has witnessed it. He has given his testimony. Meaning to say, it makes no difference what words you use, as long as you give this information item with jazm, with surety and certainty and complete confidence, then you have given your testimony, regardless of what words you use. And from the valid differences, if a person testifies or acknowledges something against himself with regards to wealth or rights, then this is accepted. But if he testifies against someone else, then this is not accepted. Rather, this is just treated as a claim for which he needs to provide evidence. But if he testifies against his own self, he does not need to provide evidence. In fact, that is counted as evidence in and of itself. And this is well understood to be a valid difference. So we can divide this acknowledgement up into 3 types. If he acknowledges something against himself, then this is an iqrar, an acknowledgement or a confession, and this is taken as an evidence in and of itself. If he testifies to something for himself against someone else, then this is a claim, because he's claiming somebody else's wealth, or that somebody else owes him something. And this claim requires an evidence, and we would not listen to him and accept this claim of his until he provides the evidence. And the third type of acknowledgement is that if he acknowledges some wealth for someone else against someone else. So for example, we have Khalid. Khalid tells us in a court that Amr owes Zayd £100. So he's testifying for someone against someone else. And this is called a shahada, or a testimony. And this is accepted as evidence as long as Khalid is a reliable witness. So we have an iqrar, a da'wah, and a shahada. These are 3 different types of statements given in a court. And from the examples of the valid differences is the difference between binding contracts and permissible contracts. So the difference is that with binding contracts, such as bay' or ijara, the parties do not have the right to annul the contract unless it be for a valid reason. As for a permissible contract or an aqdun jaiz, such as the wakala or the sharika or the ja'ala, then each of the two parties can annul it if they want to. About the bay', the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, وَإِن تَفَرَّقَا بَعْدَ أَن تَبَايَعَا وَلَمْ يَتْرُكْ وَاحِدٌ مِّنْهُمَا الْبَيْعَ فَقَدْ وَجَبَ الْبَيْعُ. If they part and none of the two parties has left this contract, so they both agree to this contract and they depart from each other's company, then the bay' becomes wajib. So in other words, it is binding and you cannot just change your mind and say, no, I don't want to go ahead with the trade anymore. Rather, it is binding. As opposed to the contract of wakala, so you appoint somebody as a wakil to do something on your behalf. So he's acting like your agent. So if you ask him to purchase something on your behalf, he can choose to do it if he wants to, but if he does not want to, he can annul this agreement. However, it needs to be said here that annulling contracts such as these, the jaiz contracts, needs to be on the condition that it will not cause harm to the other party. So for example, if person A appoints person B as a wakil to sell his house, meaning person A's house, and person B accepts this contract, and then afterwards what happens is that the number of agents to sell the house or the property either decreases substantially or are no longer present, they do not exist anymore. And so person B is the only agent to do the job for person A. Now in a case like this, if person B opts out of this agency contract, then we would tell person B, no, you are not allowed to do this, because if he did do so, it means that person A will not be able to find any other agents, and this would be a clear harm on person A. Therefore we tell person B, no, you're not allowed to opt out, and you must carry out the work for person A when you first agreed to do this. And also from the uqud jaizah is the sharika, the partnership in a company. So one of the partners can opt out of this partnership as long as it will not harm the other. However, it could be a case that in a particular custom or country, these types of contracts, the sharika contracts, are seen as binding contracts, where you are not simply allowed to opt out. So in a case like this, the customs of the people would dictate that such a sharika contract is a lazim contract, because it's like the customs of the people are dictating that if you enter into a sharika contract, then it's a condition that you're not allowed to simply opt out. So anyway, the lazim contracts and the jaiz contracts are well known in the Sharia. However, we could have some contemporary type of contracts which were not known in the classical texts of the Sharia. Then what do we say about this? Would we decide them to be lazim or jaiz? Well, it depends. We would have to take each case individually and look at it in light of the principles of the Sharia. We can also have contracts which are jaiz for one party but lazim for the other party. For example, ar-rahan and dhaman. For the one who takes the rahan, it is jaiz because he can annul the rahan contract, but the one who gives the rahan, he is obligated to it because he's the one who owes the debt. Likewise with the dhaman. If person A owes person B a debt, let's say he bought something from him, and person C comes along and says, if person A does not give you the money, then I will. He says this to person B. Now, this dhaman is jaiz for person B, because person B can simply say to person C, look, you don't have to owe me anything, because the right belongs to person B, but person C cannot opt out. And from the weaker differences is that some scholars say that all the rights which belong to a man will also belong to his inheritors after this man dies, except for the right of shuf'a, the preemption, and also the right of the khiyar al-shart, where you have the right to return the product or cancel the sale within a specified period of time. They say that these two rights do not belong to the inheritors of the deceased. But what is correct is that they do belong to the inheritors of the deceased, unless the deceased, before his death, made it plain that he is letting go of this right of his, or it be the case that the inheritors themselves let go of this right. So what we say is that the inheritors, they not only inherit the wealth of the deceased, but also his rights as well. So if the deceased had the right of preemption, the shuf'a, the inheritors also have this right. And if the deceased had the right to return a product within a specified period of time back to the seller, then the inheritors of this man after his death also have this right. So the inheritors inherit the wealth and the rights. And also from the weak differences, to illustrate this, let us take 3 scenarios, and they all involve lending something. Number 1, a person has some land, he lends this land to another person so that he can bury a deceased. Now when the deceased is buried, the owner of the land changes his mind. He says, no, I don't want to lend you this land anymore. Rather, if you're going to bury the deceased here, you're going to have to pay me, because it is my land after all. So some scholars said this is impermissible for him. The second scenario, a person owns a ship and he lends it to somebody else because the other person wants to carry some luggage on this ship. He wants to carry it on sea, of course, from one land to the other. And so the owner of the ship says, okay, go ahead, you can borrow my ship. Halfway during the journey on the sea, the owner says, I'd like my ship back. But the user says, I have to use it, I still have some way to go. The owner says, okay, if you're going to use it, you have to pay me then for the rest of the journey. Some scholars said that this is impermissible. And the third scenario, a person has some land, another person wants to use this land for agriculture because he wants to grow some crops so that he can use them, and the owner says, okay, fair enough, I will lend you the land. Then when the seeds are planted and he's waiting for the crop growth, the owner of the land says, I'd like my land back and you have to go out. But the farmer says, but I'm waiting for my crops though, how can I leave? The owner says, okay, if you're going to do this, you'll have to pay me up until the time when you harvest your crops. Some scholars said this, however, is permissible, whereas the other 2 scenarios, it was impermissible for him to take back his land or charge the other person to use the land for the rest of the time. They say that in this third scenario, it is permissible for him to return back to his land and charge the user for the land for the rest of the time, meaning up until when he harvests the crops. And this is a weak difference. Rather, we say in all 3 of the scenarios, he is not allowed to return back to his land and take ownership of it and tell the other guy to get out of the land, or if he still wants to continue using his land, to pay him, because in so doing there would be a great harm for the user of the land. Now, the user of the land came into this land using it, not expecting to pay anything, and now all of a sudden he is being forced to pay. This is a type of treachery and a trickery, to force somebody to paying you, whereas previously you agreed that he will not pay you. And if we think about it, then in all 3 of these scenarios, about burying the deceased, and about lending the ship, and about planting on his land, the owner of the land had a good idea of when this work will end. So he had a good idea when the deceased who is buried, when he will be finally rotted away, and when the ship will finally reach its destination, and when the harvest will occur. He had a good idea of when this work will finish, yet still he goes back on his word and decides to charge for the rest of the time. This is dishonesty, and we say in all 3 of these scenarios he does not have the choice to go back on his word, neither to charge the user of the land any money. If he wanted to charge money, he should have made that clear from the very beginning. And also from the weak differences, some ulama said, if a person was to give his servant as a rahan, as a pledge to another person to whom he owes the debt, so this servant now obviously belongs to his master, but the murtahin, the one to whom the debt is due, he also has a right over this servant, because if the rahin cannot pay the debt, then the murtahin is allowed to sell this servant and take back his money. Now the point is this, the servant is with the rahin, meaning the one who owes the debt. This rahin now, if he was to free this servant, what would happen? It means that he would be violating the right of the murtahin, the one to whom this rahin is due, meaning the one to whom the debt is due. So what some scholars said is that if he was to free the servant, this freedom would be valid, but he would be committing a sin in freeing the servant, because he's taking away the right of his creditor. However, they say, if he was to give his servant as a waqf or a gift, or exchange the servant for some other wealth, they say that this would be invalid, so not in effect, unless the murtahin agrees with it. So notice that this difference they make between freeing the servant and the other actions you could do with the servant in terms of giving him as a gift, as a waqf, or exchanging him with some other wealth. They make this difference. The freeing is valid, the other stuff is invalid, unless the murtahin agrees. And what is correct in this issue is that all of them are invalid. So even the freeing of the servant then is invalid, because the freeing of a servant is a taqarrub ila Allah. It is a means of you gaining a closeness to Allah. But what you have done here is haram, because you've taken away or transgressed against the rights of the murtahin, and that is haram. Now how can you draw closer to Allah by doing that which is haram? This is a contradiction. You cannot draw closer to Allah by drinking wine. It simply makes no sense. Or imagine if you were to free somebody else's servant for the sake of Allah. This would be invalid, because you're not allowed to free somebody else's servant. You are doing that which is haram, and you cannot draw closer to Allah by doing that which is haram. And also, from the weak differences is that they make the norms of society as limits. Now what do we mean by this? We'll have to use an example to illustrate. We take the example of hayd, which is menstruation. The norms of society is that a girl does not menstruate before the age of 9, and her menses stop after the age of 50. This is the normal instance in society. So in their fiqh books you would find them writing just this. You'd find them writing that if the girl has some bleeding before the age of 9, it is not given the ruling of menstrual blood, because normally women or females don't menstruate before the age of 9. Therefore any blood before the age of 9 is not given the ruling of menstrual blood. Similarly, with any bleeding after the age of 50 is not given the ruling of any menstrual blood, because this is not what is normal in society. The norms of society is what we're talking about here. And so they've used the norms of society as shari'i limits in the sharia. Also, when it comes to the period of purity in between menstrual cycles, they said that the minimum period of purity in between menstrual cycles is 13 days, and it cannot be less than 13 days. What's the reason for this limit? 13 days is a very, very specific number. There must be a clearly good and convincing swaying reason for this. Well, their swaying reason is that this is what is normal in society. Okay, what about the maximum period of nifas, which is the postnatal bleeding which the woman experiences after giving birth? What's the maximum period for this? 40 days. What is their justification? Well, they do have a narration from one of the wives of the Prophet that the women would wait for 40 days in the nifas, and so they said that the maximum is 40 days, and this is what would appear to be the norm in society. So they are taking what is normal in society and passing it off as a shari'i limit, and this is a very weak argument. You cannot take the norms in society and pass them off as a shari'i hukum, which is a shari'i ruling, or perhaps even a shari'i limit. Because to pass something off as a shari'i hukum or a shari'i had, you need a shari'i dalil. And what is normal in society is not a shari'i dalil, because what is normal in society A may not be normal in society B, simply because there are so many factors at play here. And so you cannot use the norms of one society as a yardstick for all other societies. So what does the Sharia evidence tell us? Well, here's what it says. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ قُلْ هُوَ أَذًى فَاعْتَزِلُوا النِّسَاءَ فِي الْمَحِيضِ. They ask you about the menstruation. Say to them then that it is something harmful, so you must avoid or keep away from women during their menses. So whenever this other or this harmful or annoying menstrual blood is found, then the ruling is also found. It makes not a blind bit of difference as to what the age of the girl is. And whenever this other or this harmful thing ceases, then the ruling of menstruation ceases. It's got nothing to do with 13 days or 9 years or 50 years. But it's just that some scholars would want to give particular limits with the numbers, to make life easier and more workable. However, we say the priority lies with following the text. And likewise, when it comes to the maximum period of pregnancy, they said 4 years. But this is not correct. Rather, the Sharia does not give an upper limit as to what the pregnancy could be. As for the minimum time for the pregnancy, then with this we do have Shara'i evidence. And the Quran indicates to us that it is 6 months, because it tells us that to carry this child and to give him suck with the milk is 30 months, 30 shahra. But he also tells us that his weaning is 2 years. Now that would be 24 months. So 30 minus 24 is 6 months. This leaves us 6 months of carrying him. And this therefore would have to be the minimum time for the pregnancy. We know the normal is 9 months, but we are talking about the minimum. Why is this minimum time important? It is important because if a woman marries a man, and from the date of the marriage she gives birth to a child in less than 6 months, then we are sure that this child is not to be attributed to the husband. Whereas if she gives birth to this child in 6 months or more, then we do attribute this child to the husband, because as the rule tells us that the child belongs to the husband. This is why knowing the minimum period of pregnancy is important, because we have to attribute the child to its proper father. So if we suppose then that a man dies and he leaves behind a wife, and they know she is pregnant, but she has not given birth even after 9 months, even after 1 year, do we now say her iddah period ends? Well, no, her iddah period will end when she delivers the load, even if she has to remain in pregnancy for 2 years or 3 years. There is no upper limit here. But if we know that the child is not being born because it has died, then there is no problem in taking out this child, and the woman would finish her iddah period. Or perhaps it could be that she is pregnant for a very long time, and the doctors say we could have a cesarean section and take the child out that way, and the child will still be alive and there would be no danger to his life. Well, if that's the case, this is allowed, and she will end her iddah period when the child is taken out. So the cesarean section would end the iddah period. Let us take some review questions. Question number 1. What is the difference between conditions of a contract and conditions in a contract? Question 2. What are the 3 types of conditions one can make in a contract? Question 3. Can a person annul a permissible contract in the absolute sense? Give the detail here.